Gonzaga versus St. Mary's will be an epic battle once again this season, but could this be the year the Gaels win the league outright? We're going to discuss that and more about the WCC on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. And folks, I am thrilled to be joined today once again by Zach Farmer. Zach is the host of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, discussing all things WCC Hoops. And we're going to talk about all sorts of different WCC things today. We're going to talk about teams on the rise. We're going to talk about breakout candidates. We're going to talk about some newcomers into the league to keep an eye on. But we're going to lead the show talking about Gonzaga versus St. Mary's because it is going to be a battle this year. Probably three matchups as there typically is. And Zach, before we get into the actual matchups between these two teams and the really fun individual battles that we're going to see, I kind of want to talk about St. Mary's offseason because I think on paper for folks who are just kind of checking the roster changes, they're going to look and they're not going to see a ton of changes. They're going to see Logan Johnson's gone. They're going to see Kyle Bowen is gone. They're not going to see a lot of newcomers. I think the only newcomer that's going to show up is Jordan Ross, the four-star freshman guard coming in. Of course, they do have Mason Forbes, who did not play last year, but transferred from Harvard the year previously. And I kind of want to just get your sense of the newcomers coming in and maybe how they're going to replace Johnson and Bowen, who filled very different roles, but both very impactful roles for Randy Bennett's team last year, and like maybe what that's going to look like this year in Moraga.
Yeah, and I think Randy Bennett's mentioned this a number of times that the significance that Logan Johnson and Kyle Bowen had, not only on the defensive end, but just on a leadership front.
Yeah.
The immense value that those two had, along with Alex Ducas, who does return, which I think was one of the big shockers of the early offseason, that those two were the anchor to that defense. They were kind of the soul of that team, the gritty, not pretty teams of the last couple of years. That was Logan Johnson. That was Kyle Bowen. That was really like the heart and soul of those teams. Now, that does mean that, they've been a top 15 defensive team the last 3 years. So you knew that there's probably going to be some level of a step backward on that front. But if you look on this roster, it's like, I think what you're going to start to see is maybe a little bit more of those previous St. Mary's teams that were a little bit more offensively focused, because obviously you do bring back Aidan Mahaney, who we all know was the breakout star of last year and did actually get the better of the Zags down in Moraga. Even though he did struggle a little bit the last couple of times out. You still bring back Alex Ducas, who's still one of the better three-point shooters in the league. So obviously the cupboard's not bare. This is still an incredibly talented team. Mitchell Saxen, we'll kind of dive into a little bit more of them. But you mentioned some of the newcomers. Mason Forbes is going to be really invaluable to this team, and just on an experience front. He is a transfer from Harvard. He is going to be playing that low post 4 or 5 position, going to be backing up, largely going to be at that 4 position. And they're going to be, Sammy's going to be going back and forth with Joshua Johnson, who is Jefferson, that he's going to be that guy that probably fills in at the starting spot. But he's still a young player. He's still pretty green. And we got to see some glimpses of what he can be a year ago, but I think that's one of the things to look out for. And I'm kind of excited about Jordan Ross. This is a kid that kind of complements Aidan Mahaney in a lot of ways. Aidan Mahaney is a shoot first guard, and Jordan Ross is that distributor. That's something they really haven't had in a while, that it kind of, you're going to look a little bit more like, say, like those Joe Rayhan, Emmett Nard teams where you had that kind of two-headed point guard scenario. Maybe not this year because Augustus Marcialonis is going to be playing that primary 1-2 with Mahaney, but Jordan Ross is was, I think, a fringe top 100 guy on the ESPN top 100. So it's going to be really exciting to see his development, because I think he's going to be seeing some legit minutes.
Yeah, I think Ross and Forbes strike me as guys who really kind of fit into specific roles. You mentioned Joshua Jefferson, definitely pretty green, and I think having a veteran guy kind of be able to spell him is valuable. And Ross strikes me as somebody who, like you said, maybe not a huge player in year one because they have Marcelonis, because they have Mahaney, but could be a really impactful player down the line. And what I want to chat about now, less about St. Mary's in a vacuum, but more specifically St. Mary's versus Gonzaga, because that's the matchup everybody loves. It's the best rivalry on the West Coast. It's one of the best rivalries in college basketball. And I want to phrase this to you two different ways, Zach. The first question is, if St. Mary's beats Gonzaga all 3 times, we're going to assume that they're going to play each other 3 times this year. What will it have been because? And then same question the other way. If Gonzaga beats St. Mary's all 3 times, why will that have happened? So we'll start with St. Mary's. If they beat Gonzaga, sweep them this year, twice in the regular season, beat them in the conference tournament, what will have caused that? Why will that have happened?
I think they're 2 big components, and I'm going to have to start with Mahaney, because what we saw last year was he played great in the first matchup, and then Gonzaga made adjustments in the last 2 that really changed the way that he was able to play. And a lot of teams made those adjustments to Mahaney late. We saw the same in the NCAA tournament with the likes of what VCU and also UConn did. Of course, like, those are 2 great defensive teams, so kind of you take that a little bit with a grain of salt. But what are the adjustments that he can make? If Mahaney can make the adjustments, if he has really, and it does look like from some of his Instagram posts that he's put on some muscle there in the off season, that I think that's going to be the challenge, and how St. Mary's could potentially sweep the Zags is his development and his continued process, getting stronger, getting smarter, and making those adjustments. But then it's paired with Joshua Jefferson becoming who we think he can be, who a lot of St. Mary's people think he can be. This is a guy who has the ability to be an efficient scorer inside and outside. He's a solid defender. He's a good rebounder. He has a lot of the skills. This is a guy who played high school ball with Julian Strother. So keep this in mind. They were teammates back once upon a time. So there is optimism, a lot of optimism from St. Mary's about his progression. I think that those 2 are going to be the key if this were to be a St. Mary's sweep. And I will say that'd be an unlikely sweep, but I think if that were to happen, those 2 really have to be the key components of them getting over the hump.
I think we can both agree that a sweep for either side is probably unlikely between these 2 teams. But I agree with your reasoning. I would just add a little bit to the Saxen Wessels front court, just a lot of size up front. And I think you look at Gonzaga's roster right now, and not a lot of guys over 6'9". EK and Ben Gregg and Anton Watson are all 6'8", 6'9"-ish, and I think they lack a little bit of rim protection, and I think that's an advantage for Mahaney potentially in terms of getting to the cup, and I think it's also something that could impact Gonzaga's low post scoring abilities. They don't have a Drew Timme who seems to be able to score around size very easily, so it'll be interesting to see how that part of that matchup shakes out as well. But I want to flip it on you now. Again, I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see a 3-game sweep from either team. It just doesn't happen all that often between these 2 teams. But if there was a situation where Gonzaga swept the regular season, won that conference tournament game, what do you think what would be the reasoning for that to have happened?
I think Graham Ike is the guy we all think he can be. He turns into what was going to be the preseason Mountain West Conference Player of the Year. I think that's key, and more than anything, if he is healthy, if he is the dominant player that we have seen him to be, and a lot of people expect him to be, I think that goes a long way in them potentially being able to sweep St. Mary's going into this year. Again, you mentioned like a lot of like low post presence, that low post scoring. Like, this is a guy who would be able to provide that. And if the matchups kind of are where they are, he might, I don't know if he matches up more with Saxen or if he matches up more with Jefferson. So I think that would also kind of depend on just the inside outside matchup with EK. But additionally, I think what also could play a part, because I think the guard position, I think, is the other part. Ryan Nembhard is going to do what Ryan Nembhard does. I fully expect him to be one of the best players in the league, if not the best player in the WCC this year. I think it's Nolan Hickman. And I think there's been a lot of talk about how maybe moving him off the ball is going to be beneficial to Hickman going into this year, where he had to much more rely upon being the ball handler, being the distributor, and now he can fall back into maybe a more natural position and more natural flow of the game for him this year. So I think if he plays up to what a lot of people thought he could coming out of high school, then and coming into a junior year, and sometimes that's actually what it just takes. It maybe just takes some time. Not everyone develops at the same rate, and we've seen some guys pick it up right away, and some guys it takes a few years. And maybe if Nolan Hickman develops into that guy in his third year, then along with EK, that's maybe the recipe for a sweep for Gonzaga over St. Mary's.
Yeah, you stole what I was going to say there. That was great analysis on Hickman, and I think a part of it for Gonzaga is going to just be the floor spacing abilities, because we know Steele Venters is going to shoot. Most guys who transfer to Gonzaga, you see the 3-point percentage take a bump because they're not being defended as heavily as they were at their previous school. Steele was the Big Sky Player of the Year. He's going to be just a guy for Gonzaga, fourth, fifth option offensively at times, and I think if he can shoot 40 plus 45-ish% from three, which feels reasonable. If Hickman can shoot 30, he shot 35.5 last year. So he can shoot 38, 39, 40 even. Those two guys are on the wings. That gives Nembhard more room to operate in the pick and roll. It gives EK more room, or Watson, or whoever's setting those screens. It stretches St. Mary's defense a little bit. And I think, they're still going to have Saxen down low, big anchor, and that's going to be a challenge. But being able to stretch that defense a little bit is I think, going to be a big key for Gonzaga. Now, we both kind of alluded to probably not expecting a sweep either way. What are your predictions? Again, we're talking 4 days before craziness in the kennel. We're talking a week and a half out before St. Mary's blue and white scrimmage. We're still a month out from the season, so it's early. Maybe we can revisit this before WCC season starts. But how do you expect the season to play out? These two teams are going to be dancing. Do you think they're going to be both top 5 seeds like they were last year? How do you think this might shake out for them?
I mean, both these teams' set up schedules are going to position themselves well to be top 5 seeds, both of them, if things go the way they want. The way I see this playing out, I do think that this is a season that seems to lean more in the favor of St. Mary's being the conference champion and whatnot, mainly because not only of the number of pieces that they return, who they return, but also like the depth of the St. Mary's team is a little more established than the returning group and the bench group that Gonzaga has. And I think there's going to be a learning curve for a lot of the young Zags on that team, especially the bench, because they're not going to get a ton of minutes. We know Mark Few doesn't go too deep into the rotation. He'll go maybe 6, 7, maybe he'll go 8 deep, especially once we get closer to March. And same goes for Randy Bennett. Like, we know he doesn't go very deep into that bench, but the guys who are on that bench, you have a lot of veterans now on that bench for the Gaels. So I expect that experience to play a factor as we get into conference play, because we've seen even within WCC play that experience matters. The years behind you do matter, and the older teams have done better over the course of the last few years. As far as the NCAA tournament, obviously, these two are both dancing. I do fully expect that even if St. Mary's were to win the conference, I do think that Gonzaga's schedule has set themselves up well enough that they can get the wins to still be higher seed than St. Mary's. I could still see St. Mary's sitting somewhere in that 5-6 range. I could still see Gonzaga maybe just a slight hair above that, and maybe like a 4 or a 5. So I don't think there's a ton of difference between these two teams. But it'll be fascinating to see where these two end up come March.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a really interesting season to see how it shakes out. And you alluded to Gonzaga's bench, and outside of Ben Gregg, who, assuming the starting lineup is as we expect it to be, EK, Watson, Venters, Hickman, and Nembhard, Ben Gregg is the only guy on the bench who's played at all. That's a really green bench for Mark Few and the Zags, and I think we'll see some early season struggles because of that. But Zach, I brought you on not just to talk about Gonzaga and St. Mary's, although we could do that for 30 minutes very easily, but I do want to pivot and talk about some other WCC teams, and mostly I want to talk about if we're going to see a WCC get a third team into the big dance. We've seen it before. We saw it a couple years ago with San Francisco. Can it happen again? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Birddogs. Folks, Birddogs make you look good. The Birddogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, and they give you a truly sculpted look. Birddogs shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They fit better than regular shorts that are made of stiff, restricting cotton as well, because Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki, but it stretches so that you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric, which keeps you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege or enter the promo code LockedOnCollege for a free white tech hat with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedoncollege or enter the promo code LockedOnCollege for a free white tech hat. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking out the show on YouTube. Shout out to those of you who've joined the Discord channel as well. If you want to join the Discord channel, just find the link in the show notes. It is free, and we're talking Zags hoops all day long. Zach, I want to pivot now and talk about the non-Gonzaga, non-St. Mary's teams in the conference. And we're not going to sit here and have a discussion about could anybody beat these two teams. Look, I also am a co-host on the Locked On College Basketball podcast, and one of the things we do when we do our conference previews is we talk about dark horse teams to win the league. We skipped it when we did the WCC. There's just not a dark horse. There are teams that could contend to finish third. That's kind of it. I just don't see anybody beating Gonzaga or St. Mary's. It is a two-horse race. But let's talk about who is going to finish third. Because in my mind, there are kind of three, maybe four, mostly three teams that I think are really kind of contending to finish in that third, fourth, and fifth range. So I want to hear first kind of who you think are going to be in that spot, and then we can kind of discuss the realisticness of any of those teams, not only finishing third, but actually making the NCAA tournament as an at-large bid, where obviously anybody could make it if they somehow beat Gonzaga and St. Mary's in Vegas, but if there's a chance for a team to make it outside of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're probably thinking of the same three teams, because I also am thinking there's these three, and it's USF, Santa Clara, and LMU. Yeah. They are the three that have clearly separated themselves, especially this offseason in the portal. All three, I think, did an amazing job of filling their rosters. You think about what each of them lost in the offseason. Santa Clara lost their entire starting five. USF lost 4 of the starting 5. LMU lost arguably the player of the year last year in Cam Shelton. And along with a lot of essentially their entire guard lineup is gone. So each of these teams had a lot of work to do in the offseason, and each of them look like they've done an amazing job, at least on paper, of replacing what they lost. Now, I think each of them has their own kind of like potential upside, or what's the kind of like what's the floor for each of them and what's the ceiling for each of them. I mean, USF has been the most consistent over the last 6-7 years. They've had 20 plus wins in 6 of those 7 years. The only one was the pandemic year, so you kind of like brush that one aside a little bit, and because like half the team had COVID or something like that. But USF has done a great job of rebuilding that program. Obviously, like we talk about, Mongolian Mike Sharab is kind of like the headliner of that. Jonathan Mogbo is another great addition to that team. They still have Marcus Williams. They still have Josh Coonan, great role players, great pieces that they'll be able to kind of build around. So it's going to be really interesting to talk about USF and what their chances are, because I do think they have maybe as good a case as anybody. Santa Clara, they're bringing over Adama Ball from Arizona. So he was obviously the key highlight of that. They also bring over Tyree Bryan. They brought over Johnny O'Neal. There's a lot of really good players that Santa Clara brought over as well, let alone the fact that they still have Christoph Tilley, who a lot of people are incredibly high on. He played great at the end of last year. He's going to be a sophomore next year. So a lot of upside, I think, to Tilley. Not same spelling as different spelling Tilley. But yeah, Santa Clara has done a lot of work there to rebuild that roster. Herb Sendek's done a great job. And the last couple of years, they're the team that's finished third. Then we talk about LMU, and their front court is back, and that's a bruising front court, as anyone in this league knows. Kelly Lalo Pepe's back. You bring back Michael Graham, Rick Asanza. You bring back Alex Merkvaladze. Like that is a rough front court that you're going to have to mess with at LMU. And then they bring in a lot of really interesting guards, including Dom Harris. He just went down the road, so he's going to get an opportunity to play. And so each of the I could see any one of these three teams claiming that 3 spot. And as we kind of like dive into tournament wise, I think it's really going to come down to their schedules. But honestly, like it really feels like they're going to eat each other alive. They're just going to beat each other up, which could potentially cost any one of them that shot. But these three, they're all really, really good.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. I think I probably lean San Francisco as well. I know that's who you started with. I don't know if that's because you had them first in that list or not, but I really like this addition of Mongolian Mike, Sheriff Jomps. Like you said, I think he's a guy who's going to probably play the 1, maybe play a little bit on the 2, kind of depending on how Coach Gurlifson wants to do it. But he's 6'8". And he can really truly play the point guard, and you just don't see guys like that very often in the WCC. I mean, you don't see those guys very much in college basketball at all. That's why he was a top 100 prospect, and things didn't go quite according to plan at Dayton. But I think this is when he committed to USF, he had a top 4, and I think the other 3 schools were all Power 5, Power 6 programs, and he ends up coming to San Francisco. He wanted to be part of the culture in the city of San Francisco. A really nice addition for Coach Gurlifson. I'm really excited to see what he can do, what Mogbo can do, what some of the returners can do. They got Stefan Todorovic as well coming in to shoot the lights out, according to Coach Gurlifson. So I think there's some excitement about them. But I agree with you that the odds of any of these teams getting an at-large bid feel slim. And it's unfortunate because the main reasoning is none of them are going to go 4-0 against Gonzaga or St. Mary's, Gonzaga and St. Mary's. Maybe one of these teams can go 2-2. Maybe. I think that's possible. All 3 of these teams are good enough to steal a game from each Gonzaga or St. Mary's. But the problem is if you go 2-2 against Gonzaga and St. Mary's, you also have to sweep the other teams. If it's San Francisco, you have to sweep LMU, you have to sweep Santa Clara, and you cannot drop a single game to Pacific or San Diego or Pepper. I mean, you can't drop one. You have to be perfect. And the year that San Francisco did get a 10 seed and they did make the NCAA tournament, they were pretty much perfect. Like you had to be that good. And I think with, advancements in, in how we evaluate talent and advancements in like things like Ken Pom and Torvik and those kind of ranking systems, we can understand how good this team is. But at the end of the day, it's really, really hard to get an at-large bid out of the WCC. It's been proven time and time again that that's just not something that's going to happen all that often, which is unfortunate because I am every year I see teams in the NCAA tournament and I'm like, that didn't get an automatic bid that I think Santa Clara is better than, that I think San Francisco is better than, that I think LMU is better than. Not a ton, mind you. It's not like these teams should be 5 seeds or anything, but these are teams that I believe strongly are good enough to get into that conversation. And if they just get a play-in against, a 500 team out of the ACC, against Clemson or NC State or whatever, like maybe they lose that play-in game 5 out of 10 times, but they might win it. Like these teams are good enough to win those kind of games. And I wish they would get those opportunities.
So the one thing I will say, because I do think at least 2 of them, that's both Santa Clara and USF, I think have the non-conference schedule that will help. At least they will get the opportunities to pick up some wins. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy for either one of them because it's just rattling down what USF has. They do have Boise State on the road. They have Arizona State on the road, Vandy on the road, Utah State, Fresno State. Like they have chances. But they have to take advantage of those chances.
You got to go probably 5-0 or maybe 4-1 in that group.
Right. You can't drop one. They have a game against Grand Canyon. Again, I think that's like you can't lose to Grand Canyon. You better win that game. Like they're hosting Minnesota at Chase Center. Like that's an absolute, you cannot drop that game. And so you're right. Like there's a level of perfection that these teams have to hit because otherwise it will be just it will be the thing that's hung over their head all
Mhm.
season long. Even now, the one thing I'm kind of like really looking at is Santa Clara, because I do think Santa Clara is the next one based on just what Herb Sendek's been able to do the last couple of years. They are at Stanford. They have Oregon. They play then Alabama or Ohio State. They have New Mexico, Utah State, Washington State. Like, they also have the games. A lot of these will be top 100 games, probably a lot of Q2, Q1 games.
Yeah.
They have the chances. So, but once again in the conference play, you can't lose to anybody else. You cannot drop a random game to Pacific. And keep in mind, Pacific was 5th last year. Or like, you can't have to think about how you can't drop those games. And maybe, I mean, USF got into the tournament without having to beat Gonzaga or St. Mary's. So it is possible to get in without having beat either one, but you better not lose to anybody else.
Well, Zach, we're going to close out the show discussing some breakout candidates in the WCC, some newcomers to keep an eye on for folks who, haven't been paying as close attention to the offseason as we have, and they're wondering who are the guys that are going to surprise us next season. We're going to talk about those players all coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time than right now to get in on the action. The app, it's super easy to use. You can bet on all sorts of stuff like spreads and player props and over-unders and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, Zach, let's get into it. I think we've got a lot of newcomers in the WCC this year, a lot of players that I kind of envision Gonzaga fans, on Zag Twitter or on our Discord channel who are watching the games for the first time, watching USF for the first time, or Santa Clara or LMU, or there are other teams in the WCC we talk about too, but who are going to say, who's that guy? Who's that? And I remember last year, we were hyping up Aidan Mahaney a lot before the season, and look what he became. And certainly Gonzaga fans probably are covering their ears when they hear his name, and I can't blame them for that. But we kind of touched on a few of these guys already. We talked about Mike Sheriff Jams, and we talked a little bit about Adama Ball, but are there other newcomers joining the league, or we could talk more about those guys who are going to be first-time WCC players who you think Gonzaga fans or WCC fans or just general college basketball fans are going to want to be paying attention to this year?
So outside of the two we've already kind of mentioned, I'm going to bring up a third, because this is a guy who WCC fans should be at least somewhat familiar with, because he was on the Murray State team that USF had to face just a couple years ago in the NCAA tournament, and that's Justice Hill. He was at LSU last year. Things did not go according to plan for him, and so he was able to transfer to LMU. And this is going to be a guy who I think is going to make an immediate impact. He was one of the key guys on that 30-win Murray State team. This was I'm just taking a look at the stats from that year: 13 points a game, 5 assists. He's a 2.6 assist to turnover ratio. He was the OVC tournament MVP. This guy is someone you're going to have to keep an eye on, have to watch all preseason long. Now, he may not be to like the explosive Cam Shelton level that we saw a year ago, but this is going to be a key component to what he's going to be a key component to what LMU does and how successful they're going to be going into this year.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Justice Hill. He was one of the guys I was going to bring up there too, because I'm so fascinated by how LMU's guard rotation is going to shake out, because I think Justice Hill is going to start again, coming down from LSU, having all that success at Murray State. Dominic Harris, of course, is a guy that he probably didn't transfer to LMU to come off the bench, but they also add 2 double-digit per game scorers in Will Johnston and Justin Wright, coming from smaller schools. Johnston comes from Texas Rio Grande Valley. Justin Wright comes from NC Central, but these were really productive productive players. And you get those two guys, you get Dom coming in, you also get Justice Hill coming in. Like you said, they cleared out basically all their guards. So all four of these guys have a real opportunity to play, but somebody's going to be fourth. And it's kind of hard to look at that group and almost figure out who that's going to be, because I think all these guys have the ability to be productive for Coach Stan Johnson this year. And then you tack on top of that Lars Tiemann coming over from Cal, a guy who was productive in the Pac-12 at a horrendous Pac-12 team last year. Cal was very bad, but he was still productive against Pac-12 opponents. So to me, I mean, that's five very intriguing newcomers. Of course, four who might not be as familiar to Gonzaga fans, one who they're going to be much more familiar with, but it's going to be really more so than USF, more so than Santa Clara, who I think made additions. I don't want to say around the edges. Certainly Ball and Mongolian Mike are big additions, but LMU replaced the whole guard rotation and got a new center. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that all shakes out for the Lions this year.
Yeah, and just one other name, I think, like of the maybe returners that could be that breakout. And I kind of already mentioned him as Christoph Tilley, at Santa Clara, is maybe that guy of the returners, who I think is one we have to really kind of keep an eye on and see what his development is going to be like going into the year.
Yeah, I'm curious too with Santa Clara whether it'll be Tilley or Francisco Cafaro, the center they brought over from Virginia, who starts, who plays more minutes, how that kind of shakes out. But I also had one returnee breakout candidate, so I'll toss him in here as well. And that's Malik Moore at Pepperdine. Pepperdine not expected to be very good, hasn't been very good, even though they've had a tremendous amount of talent. And that's the case again this year, because they have Javon Porter, who was voted by the coaches in an anonymous poll at the Almanac, was voted as the best NBA prospect in the conference. And I think there's some legitimacy to that for Javon Porter. He's a big guy, stretch the floor, kind of has that modern NBA build. Of course, is the younger brother of Michael Porter Jr., who was a tremendous player for the Denver Nuggets. And they also still have Houston Millett, who's been fantastic for the last couple of years, very legitimate chance at contending to be the all-league guy for Pepperdine. But they need a third guy. And Maxwell Lewis he wasn't the third guy last year, but he was a key part of last year's team. He's out the door. He averaged 17 plus per game. And Malik Moore is kind of the guy that I think Coach Romar wants to step into that role. He's a 6'5" wing. He wasn't super productive last year. I think he's about 5 points per game, something like that, but shot 42.5% from three. I think a bigger role for him, you could see him really potentially step up again. I don't expect Pepperdine to be all that good, but I do think that he might be a guy who surprises some people with his productivity this year. Zach, let's close out the show with coaching conversations, because in my research for Locked On College Basketball, I learned that the WCC is one of, I think, 3 or 4 conferences that did not have a single coaching change this offseason. I don't think that will be true next offseason. I don't know the last time that any Division I conference went 2 straight years without a single coaching change. That just seems unlikely to happen in this era. But I'm curious your thoughts on the coaching carousel in the WCC. Are there coaches that you think are their seats warming up? This might be, they got to win this year to even keep their job. Or the flip side, are there coaches who maybe, if they do finish third, if they do sneak into the big dance, if they do pull some of those upsets, might end up getting a different job, as we saw with Todd Golden a few years ago? Like, who do you kind of think might not be coaching in the WCC after this season?
So I think there's a couple that kind of come to mind. And I mean, first off, we have to, I think, talk a little bit about Lorenzo Romar at Pepperdine. Now, I will say this, in the second round, just because I was thinking about his name, but because they have been a terrible team the last couple of years, despite the immense amount of talent that this team has had. But you do have to remember that when he came in, he did have a losing team the first year, but then he had the Colby Ross teams, Kessler Edwards teams, and those were some of the more competitive teams in the WCC for a couple of years there, because he hasn't been back at Pepperdine for all too long. So maybe you can excuse a couple of down years. I don't think it's not a hot seat. It might just be starting to warm up just a bit. So I don't think there's too much danger. Honestly, maybe it is going to be 2 straight years, but I think what might be more likely is the opposite, kind of like the Todd Golden example of And that example might be Stan Johnson.
Yeah.
If LMU has the breakout year this year and somehow is able to reach the NCAA tournament, keep in mind, this was the only team who did beat both Gonzaga and St. Mary's a year ago.
Yeah.
Outside of UConn.
Right. That's true.
That would be the resume builder to say that not only did you have winning seasons in 3 of your 4 years at LMU, which, by the way, LMU hasn't had back-to-back winning seasons since the early 90s, that is an accomplishment in and of itself to build that program up to the point of not only having successful seasons year after year, but to get that program back to an NCAA tournament, to bring back the memories of Bo Kimball and Hank Gathers and kind of like bring that all back. I mean, think about what all the buzz was around USF when they finally got back to the tournament. There's all the talks about Bill Russell and Casey Jones and Bill Cartwright. Similar would be for LMU if they were to get back to the dance, and they would have all that attention around them. And that would be an amazing feat. And so I think like if that were to happen, like that's where I see it happening, is on like the success story and someone leaving the conference.
Yep, I'm with you 100%. I do actually think there's a reasonable chance that there isn't another coaching change next year, because there isn't anybody that I think is on like a super hot seat. Leonard Perry hasn't been there long enough, and they won 15 games last year. Steve Lavin hasn't been there long enough, even though I don't think he did a particularly good job last year.
They're going full rebuild now.
Yeah, they're going to give him more time, and they probably should. On the flip side, like Chris Gerlofson, I think is a very good coach, but I don't think he's there yet. I don't think he's going to get poached quite yet. Shante Leggins hasn't quite proven it consistently enough to get a promoted job. I think it could happen for him eventually as well, although I think he signed a good extension to stay at UP for a while as well. Romar, maybe, but I think Pepperdine's kind of content bringing in decent talent and doing okay. And like you said, they're only a few years removed from being a decent team. So I kind of think that the coaching carousel might miss the WCC once again, but if I was picking the most likely candidate to leave the conference next year, I'm sticking with who you went with. I'm going with Stan Johnson, because I think there's a reasonable chance that LMU, especially if they get in the dance, he's gone for sure. He's gone for sure. If they don't get in the dance, but they finish third, maybe he'll get some looks somewhere else. But
the only other one that's kind of is in the back of my mind is Herb Sendek at Santa Clara. But considering where he is in the stage of his career, I don't think there's a huge reason to leave Santa Clara, because Santa Clara, I mean, amongst WCC schools, has as many resources as you could possibly want. So resource wise, you're not hurting.
I think he might retire while coaching at Santa Clara. Like, I think that's a reasonable fitting end to his career, especially if he can get this team into the dance, which is certainly possible with the way he's been recruiting.
And then this thing of the 3-headed coaching monster of Few Bennett and Sendek.
I know, it's wild. All right, Zach, that's going to wrap us up for today. This was so much fun. I love getting the opportunity to chat WCC hoops. And like I said, hopefully we get a chance to do this again, maybe in late December before the actual conference starts, and maybe get a better look at how these teams are shaping up to start the season. That's going to wrap us up for today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We are going to be back every single day this week, 5 times per week, and we're going to start our player preview series next week, talk about every single player on the roster, so definitely stick with us as we get into that. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.